My name is Leah. I still remember that terrifying flight like it was yesterday. The plane was cruising at 35,000 feet somewhere over Montana when chaos erupted. The man who had been sitting next to me suddenly stood up, his body rigid and trembling. His eyes were wild, and his jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like ropes. "Listen to me," he shouted, his voice loud but shaky. "This plane is never going to land. None of you understand what's really happening." As he reached into his jacket, my heart stopped. For that one terrible second, I was sure I was going to die. But then, a woman who I thought was a flight attendant sprang into action. She moved like lightning, grabbing his wrist and twisting it hard. In less than 2 seconds, she had him face down on the seat, completely helpless. It was only then that I learned the truth. She wasn't a flight attendant at all. She was an undercover federal air marshal named Ava. And she had been watching that man, whose name was Carl, since before we even took off. Let me take you back to the beginning. It was a Friday night in early June, and I was at Denver International Airport, waiting to board a red-eye flight to New York. I'm a freelance web developer, and I've been living in San Francisco for the past few years. But my younger brother Ethan was graduating from college, and there was no way I was going to miss it. My parents, Linda and Tom, are the most loving and supportive people. They've always encouraged me and my siblings to follow our dreams. My mom had been calling me every day for the past week, going over all the details of the graduation and the celebration afterward. I assured her that I had everything under control, although I had only managed to buy Ethan a gift at the last minute at the airport store. I was exhausted that night. I had been working on a big project for a client and had stayed up until 2 a.m. the night before to finish it. I only got a few hours of sleep, packed my bag, and headed to the airport. My plan was simple: get on the plane, sleep, and wake up in New York. When they called my boarding group, I grabbed my backpack and joined the line. The plane was a typical domestic jet, about 2/3 full. I found my seat, 22B, a middle seat near the back. The window seat was occupied by a young girl, maybe 18 or 19, with long blonde hair and a pair of large headphones on. She didn't even look up when I sat down. She just leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. The man in the aisle seat was Carl. He looked to be in his late 40s, with a receding hairline and a face that showed signs of stress. He was wearing a wrinkled suit, as if he had been traveling for a long time. When I sat down, he turned to me with a forced smile. "Heading to New York?" he asked. I nodded. "Family stuff." Nice. "I'm Carl," he said, sticking out his hand. I shook it, and his palm was cold and damp. For the next few minutes, as the rest of the passengers boarded and the flight attendants did their safety checks, Carl kept talking. He told me he was a sales manager for a software company and that he traveled a lot. He also mentioned that his daughter lived in New York, and that was part of the reason he was going. He asked me about my job, where I lived, and if I had a boyfriend. I answered him in short, polite sentences, hoping he would take the hint. But he just kept going. There was something about him that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't that he was threatening or aggressive, but he was just too intense. He sat too close, and he kept looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just a lonely guy who wanted someone to talk to on the long flight. The plane took off a little after 11 p.m. The lights in the cabin dimmed, and most of the passengers settled in for the 6-hour flight. I put in my earbuds and tried to sleep, but I couldn't relax. Carl's arm kept brushing against mine on the armrest, and his leg kept shifting closer to my space. About an hour into the flight, a flight attendant came down the aisle with the beverage cart. Her name tag said Ava. She was in her early 30s, with short black hair and a calm, professional demeanor. When she reached our row, she looked at each of us in turn. The girl by the window didn't want anything. Carl ordered a whiskey, and I asked for a soda. As Ava handed me my drink, our eyes met for a brief moment. There was something in her gaze, something sharp and watchful. It was gone in an instant, and then she moved on to the next row. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just sipped my soda and tried to ignore Carl. The first hour of the flight passed slowly. I couldn't sleep no matter how hard I tried. Every time I started to doze off, Carl would shift in his seat or clear his throat, and I would wake up. He stopped trying to talk to me, but that somehow made it worse. He became restless, fidgeting with his seatbelt and checking his watch every few minutes. He ordered another whiskey when the flight attendant came around again, and then another one 20 minutes later. I was surprised that he was getting so many drinks, especially on a late-night flight. I thought airlines were supposed to limit alcohol service, but no one seemed to be paying attention. By the second hour, Carl's behavior had changed significantly. He started muttering to himself under his breath. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but I could tell he was agitated. His leg bounced up and down rapidly, shaking the whole row. The girl by the window was still asleep, completely oblivious. I was starting to get really nervous. I could feel the tension radiating off him. I thought about asking a flight attendant if I could move to a different seat, but I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to be the one who overreacted. Then, Ava appeared beside our row. She walked up with the same calm expression on her face. She smiled at me, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Then she leaned down and handed me a folded cocktail napkin. "Excuse me, miss. You dropped this earlier," she said. I looked at the napkin in confusion. I hadn't dropped anything. But there was something in her voice and in her eyes that made me take it. I unfolded it under the tray table, keeping it low so Carl couldn't see. Inside, written in neat black ink, were 5 words, "Switch seats with me now." I looked up at Ava. Her face was completely neutral, but her eyes were locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. She gave me a tiny nod. I didn't ask any questions. I just unbuckled my seatbelt, grabbed my backpack, and squeezed past Carl into the aisle. "Where are you going?" Carl asked, annoyed. "Bathroom," I mumbled without looking at him. Ava pointed to a seat 3 rows back on the opposite side of the aisle. It was next to an elderly man named Mr. Thompson, who was reading a newspaper. I walked to the seat and sat down, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely fasten my seatbelt. When I looked back at my old row, Ava was already sitting in my seat. She pulled out a magazine from the seat pocket and opened it, but I noticed that she wasn't reading. Her eyes were fixed on Carl, watching his every move. I sat there, my heart pounding in my ears. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew that Ava had just saved me from something. I was filled with questions. Who was she? Why did she want me to move? What did she know about Carl that I didn't? Mr. Thompson noticed my distress. "Are you all right, dear?" he asked. "You look pale." I took a deep breath. "I'm fine. Just a nervous flyer," I said. He nodded sympathetically. "I used to be the same way. But you know, the pilots do this every day. It's just another routine for them." He patted my hand gently. "We'll be on the ground before you know it." He started telling me about his grandchildren, and I tried to focus on his words, but I couldn't stop looking back at Carl. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The cabin was quiet, and most of the passengers were asleep. Everything seemed normal, and I started to think that maybe I had overreacted. But then, Carl stood up. It happened so suddenly. One second he was sitting there, and the next he was on his feet, shouting and waving his arms. He started ranting about how the plane was never going to land, that there was some kind of conspiracy. A real flight attendant rushed down the aisle, telling him to sit down. But Carl just turned towards her, his hands raised. "Don't come near me," he shouted. "None of you understand what's going on. That's when Ava sprang into action. She moved with incredible speed and precision. Before Carl could do anything, she had him subdued. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small radio. "This is Federal Air Marshal Ava Reed. I have a passenger restrained in row 22. Situation is contained. Requesting zip ties and medical assessment upon landing." It was then that I realized she had been watching Carl the whole time, waiting for the right moment to act. One of the flight attendants brought over a set of zip ties, and Ava secured Carl's wrists behind his back. As Carl sat there, sobbing, I noticed something on the floor near his feet. It was a small bottle of pills and a crumpled letter. It turned out that Carl had been going through a severe mental health crisis, made worse by the alcohol he had consumed. He hadn't been planning to hurt anyone on the plane, he had just wanted to end his own life. The next 20 minutes were a blur. The captain came on the intercom, telling everyone to remain calm. The flight attendants walked through the aisles, checking on passengers and offering water. Ava stayed with Carl, speaking to him in a low voice. When the plane landed at JFK International Airport, there were police and paramedics waiting. Carl was taken off the plane, and I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and pity. After giving a statement to the police, I finally made my way out of the airport. Ethan was waiting for me at the arrivals area, holding a sign that said "Welcome home, Leah." When I saw his face, I broke down in tears. He hugged me tightly, not asking any questions, just holding me until I felt better. A few days later, I got a call from Ava. She wanted to check in on me and explain what had happened. She told me that she had noticed Carl's strange behavior from the moment I boarded the plane. She had been trained to recognize the signs of someone in distress, and she knew that he was a potential threat. She also told me that Carl was getting the help he needed. She said, "You trusted your instincts that night, Leah. You knew something was wrong, even before I gave you that note. Don't ever stop listening to that voice inside you." Those words have stuck with me. I think about how close I came to ignoring my gut feeling, how I almost stayed in that seat because I didn't want to make a scene. But one small decision to trust a stranger changed everything. So, if you ever find yourself in a situation where something doesn't feel right, trust your instincts. And be grateful for those angels in disguise who show up when you need them most.